The morning sun cast long shadows across the Dakota territory as 17-year-old Ayanna crouched behind a cluster of wild sagebrush, her heart pounding so hard she feared it might give away her hiding place. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, their hooves thundering against the hard-packed earth like drums of war. She pressed herself lower, her traditional beaded dress catching on the thorny bushes. But she dared not move to free it. 3 days had passed since the raiders attacked her village. The memory still burned fresh in her mind, like a brand against her soul. She could still hear her grandmother's final words, whispered urgently, as she pushed a small leather pouch into Ayanna's trembling hands. "Run, little fox. Find the white rancher with kind eyes. He will help you." Her grandmother had spoken of this man before, a cattle rancher who had traded fairly with their people and shown respect for their ways. The horses were closer now, and Ayanna could hear the rough voices of men calling to each other. These were not the same raiders who had destroyed her home. But in these lawless lands, any group of armed men could mean danger for a young Lakota woman traveling alone. She had learned to trust no one except her own instincts, which had kept her alive for 3 terrifying days and nights. As the riders passed, Ayanna caught glimpses of them through the brush. 5 men, heavily armed, with the hard look of those who lived by violence. Their clothes were dusty and stained, their faces unshaven and cruel. One of them, a man with a scar running from his left eye to his jawline, seemed to be their leader. He called out orders in a voice that made Ayanna's skin crawl. When the sound of their horses finally faded into the distance, Ayanna slowly rose from her hiding place. Her legs were stiff from crouching, and her stomach ached with hunger. She had eaten nothing but wild berries and stream water since fleeing her village. The small pouch her grandmother had given her contained only a few precious items: a piece of sacred sage, a tiny bone needle, and 3 silver coins her grandmother had saved for years. Ayanna looked toward the horizon, where smoke rose from what she hoped was the rancher's homestead. Her grandmother had described the place, a large wooden house with a red roof, surrounded by corrals and pastures where cattle grazed. It would be different from anything in her village, but her grandmother had insisted the man who lived there was honorable. The walk took her through rolling hills covered in prairie grass that swayed like ocean waves in the constant wind. Occasionally, she would drop to the ground when she heard sounds that might indicate riders, but most turned out to be cattle or wild horses. Her feet, protected only by thin moccasins, began to ache on the rough ground. As afternoon turned toward evening, Ayanna finally saw the ranch her grandmother had described. The house was indeed large and wooden, with a red roof that caught the last rays of sunlight. Smoke drifted from the chimney, and she could see cattle scattered across the nearby pastures. Several horses stood in a corral near a large barn. It looked peaceful, almost welcoming, but Ayanna had learned that appearances could be deceiving. She crept closer, using whatever cover she could find. Behind a water trough, she observed the homestead carefully. A man emerged from the barn, and Ayanna's breath caught in her throat. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair and weathered skin that spoke of years working under the prairie sun. This had to be the rancher her grandmother had mentioned. The man moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own domain, checking on his animals and securing equipment for the night. Ayanna noticed he carried no weapon, which was unusual for men in this territory. Most settlers went armed at all times, knowing that danger could come from any direction. As she watched, the rancher paused and looked directly toward her hiding place. For a moment, Ayanna thought she had been discovered, but he simply continued his evening routine. Still, something in his manner suggested he knew he was being observed. Perhaps years of living on the frontier had given him the same instincts that kept wild animals alive. Darkness began to fall, and Ayanna knew she had to make a decision. She could try to continue traveling in the dark, risking encounters with wild animals or worse, or she could approach the rancher and hope her grandmother's judgment had been correct. The thought of another night alone in the wilderness, cold and hungry, made the choice for her. She rose slowly from behind the water trough and walked toward the house, her hands held where they could be seen. The rancher noticed her immediately and stopped his work. But he did not reach for a weapon or call out in alarm. Instead, he simply watched her approach, his expression neutral but not hostile. When she was close enough to speak without shouting, Ayanna stopped. Her knowledge of English was limited, learned from traders who had visited her village, but she had practiced the words she might need during her long journey. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need help." The rancher studied her for a long moment, taking in her torn dress, her exhausted appearance, and the fear that she could not quite hide despite her efforts to appear calm. "You're a long way from anywhere," he said finally, his voice gruff but not unkind. "What brings you here, young lady?" Ayanna took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "Bad men. They came to my village. Many dead. I ran." The words came out halting and broken, but the rancher seemed to understand. His expression softened slightly. "Raiders?" She nodded. "3 days I walk. Hide from men with guns." She gestured vaguely in the direction from which she had come. "My grandmother. She tell me about you. Say you help people." The rancher was quiet for a moment, considering her words. Ayanna could see the calculation in his eyes as he weighed the risks of helping her against his own conscience. In this territory, helping the wrong person could bring deadly consequences, but turning away someone in genuine need could weigh just as heavily on a man's soul. "What's your name?" he asked finally. "Ayanna," she replied, then added in case he did not understand. "It mean eternal blossom in my language." "I'm Jacob Morrison," the rancher said. "This is my land." He gestured toward the house and outbuildings. "You look like you haven't eaten in a while." Ayanna nodded, suddenly aware of how hollow her stomach felt. "I eat berries. Drink water from stream." Jacob Morrison studied her again, and Ayanna saw something shift in his expression. Perhaps it was the mention of her grandmother, or maybe just the sight of a young person clearly in distress. But whatever it was, seemed to make up his mind for him. "Well, Ayanna," he said, "I reckon we can find you something better than berries." He turned toward the house, then paused. "You said bad men came to your village. Are they likely to come looking for you?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire. Ayanna knew her answer would determine whether Jacob Morrison would help her or send her away. She could lie, tell him the danger had passed, but something about his direct gaze made her want to tell the truth. "I do not know," she admitted. "They take what they want. Kill who fight back. Maybe they think all dead. Maybe they look for some who run away." She paused, then added quietly, "I try not to bring trouble to you. Maybe they look for some who run away." Jacob Morrison nodded slowly, as if her honesty had confirmed something he needed to know about her character. "Trouble has a way of finding folks out here, whether they invite it or not," he said. "Come on. Let's get you fed and cleaned up. We'll worry about the rest tomorrow." As they walked toward the house, Ayanna felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Her grandmother had been right about this man. There was kindness in his eyes, even if his manner was gruff and practical. For the first time in 3 days, she allowed herself to hope that she might survive whatever was coming. The house was larger inside than it had appeared from outside, with sturdy furniture and walls decorated with simple but well-made items. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, filling the main room with warmth and the scent of burning wood. It was so different from the hide lodges of her village, yet something about the atmosphere reminded her of home. Jacob Morrison led her to a wooden table and gestured for her to sit. "I'll heat up some stew," he said, moving toward what appeared to be a cooking area. "Made it fresh this morning, so it should still be good." As he prepared the food, Ayanna looked around the room more carefully. She noticed there were no signs of a woman's presence, no children's belongings scattered about. Jacob Morrison lived alone, which probably made his decision to help her easier. He would not have to worry about endangering a family. When he placed a bowl of stew in front of her, the smell made her stomach clench with hunger. She had not realized how desperately her body needed real food until it was there before her. She ate slowly at first, trying to maintain some dignity. But hunger soon overcame her restraint. Jacob Morrison watched her eat with a mixture of sympathy and concern. "When did you last have a real meal?" he asked. Ayanna paused between spoonfuls. "Before the bad men come," she said. 3 days, maybe 4. Time. Difficult to know. He nodded, understanding. I've got a spare room where you can sleep tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out what to do next. The mention of tomorrow brought back all of Ayanna's fears. She set down her spoon and looked at Jacob Morrison directly. The men I see today, on horses, they look for something. Maybe they look for people like me. Jacob Morrison's expression grew serious. You saw riders today? How many? 5 men. Bad men, I think. One have scar here. She traced a line down the left side of her face. They ride toward the big water. 1. That would be Lake Mackenzie, Jacob Morrison said, his frown deepening. Sounds like the Garrett gang. They've been causing trouble all along the territory border. He was quiet for a moment, then asked, Do you think they were tracking you specifically? Ayanna shook her head. I hide good. They not see me. But they ask questions in town, maybe. Ask about people running from village. She hesitated, then added, If they come here, I go. I not want you hurt because of me. Jacob Morrison's expression softened again. Let's not borrow trouble before we have to, he said. Finish your stew and get some rest. Morning has a way of making things clearer. As Ayanna finished eating, she found herself studying Jacob Morrison's face. Her grandmother had always told her she could judge a person's character by looking into their eyes. This man's eyes were the color of autumn leaves, brown with flecks of gold, and they held no deception that she could detect. Whatever his reasons for helping her, they seemed genuine. When she finished eating, Jacob Morrison showed her to a small but clean room with a narrow bed and a washstand. There's water in the pitcher, he said, and clean cloths for washing. I'll be in the next room if you need anything. Alone for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Ayanna allowed herself to truly feel the exhaustion that had been building for days. She washed as best she could with the water and cloths, then lay down on the bed still wearing her torn dress. The mattress felt impossibly soft after nights sleeping on the hard ground. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch settling for the night, Ayanna thought about her grandmother's final words. The old woman had spoken of the rancher as if she knew him personally, but Ayanna had never heard his name mentioned in the village before that terrible morning. How had her grandmother known about Jacob Morrison's character? Had there been dealings between them that Ayanna was not aware of? These questions followed her toward sleep, along with the ever-present fear that tomorrow might bring the sound of approaching horses and men with guns looking for a Lakota girl who had escaped their violence. But for tonight, she was warm and fed and safe. And that was more than she had dared hope for when she first saw the ranch house in the distance. Outside, the prairie wind continued its endless song across the grasslands, carrying with it the scents of sage and wildflowers and the promise of storms that might come with the dawn. In the main room, Jacob Morrison sat by the dying fire, cleaning his rifle and thinking about the responsibility he had just accepted. He had seen enough violence in his years on the frontier to know that trouble often traveled in the footsteps of those who fled from it. But he had also seen enough suffering to know that sometimes a person's character was measured not by the risks they avoided, but by the ones they chose to take for the right reasons. Whatever tomorrow brought, he would face it as he had always faced challenges on this harsh but beautiful land, with determination, preparation, and the hope that doing right would somehow be enough. Dawn arrived with the sound of distant thunder, though the sky showed only scattered clouds that promised rain but no immediate storm. Ayanna woke to unfamiliar sounds, the lowing of cattle, the creak of windmill blades turning in the morning breeze, and the steady rhythm of an axe splitting wood. For a moment, she forgot where she was, and panic seized her heart until memory returned. She was safe. At least for now. In the house of the rancher Jacob Morrison, she rose quietly and looked out the small window of her room. Jacob Morrison was already at work, splitting wood near the barn while keeping a watchful eye on his surroundings. Even in the simple task of cutting firewood, she noticed how he positioned himself to see approaches from all directions. This was a man who had learned to survive in dangerous territory. When she emerged from the room, she found bread, dried meat, and coffee waiting on the table. Jacob Morrison looked up from checking his rifle at the kitchen window. Sleep well? he asked, though his attention remained partly focused on scanning the horizon. Yes, thank you. Ayana sat at the table, but found her appetite diminished by the tension she could feel radiating from her host. You see something? Jacob Morrison set the rifle aside and joined her at the table. Maybe, maybe not. Saw dust on the horizon about an hour ago, but it could be anything. Wild horses, cattle, travelers heading to town. He paused, studying her face. Could be men looking for someone. Ayana set down the piece of bread she had been about to eat. I should go. If they come here and find me, they hurt you too. Now hold on, Jacob Morrison said, his voice firm but not harsh. Running off into the prairie won't help either of us. If those riders are looking for you, they'll pick up your trail easy enough. Better to stay put and see what develops. The wisdom of his words made sense, but staying put felt like waiting for a trap to close. Ayana had survived the last 3 days by constant movement, by never remaining in one place long enough for pursuers to find her. The idea of voluntarily staying in a fixed location went against every instinct that had kept her alive. In my village, she said carefully, we have saying, the rabbit that runs lives longer than the rabbit that hides in the same hole. Jacob Morrison smiled grimly. Maybe so. But sometimes the rabbit needs to pick the right hole. One with more than one way out. He gestured toward the back of the house. There's a root cellar out back, hidden by the garden. If trouble comes calling, you can get there quick and stay hidden until it passes. Before Ayana could respond, they both heard the unmistakable sound of multiple horses approaching at a steady pace. Jacob Morrison was on his feet instantly, grabbing his rifle and moving to the window. 5 riders, he confirmed after a moment. Armed and riding like they own the territory. Ayana's heart began to race, but she forced herself to think clearly. The man with the scar? Can't tell yet, but they're coming straight here. No wandering around like folks just passing through. Jacob Morrison turned to her with sudden urgency. Get to that root cellar. Take this. He handed her a small knife in a worn leather sheath. Just in case. What about you? Ayana asked, accepting the weapon. I'll handle the talking. These men might just be looking for supplies or information. No need to assume the worst until we know for sure. But his grip on the rifle suggested he was prepared for exactly the worst. Ayana slipped out the back door and found the root cellar exactly where Jacob Morrison had described it, concealed beneath what appeared to be an ordinary garden plot. The entrance was covered by a wooden door, disguised to look like part of the ground itself. She lifted it carefully and descended into the dark space below. The cellar was larger than she had expected, with shelves lined with preserved foods and storage containers. But what caught her attention was a narrow tunnel that led away from the main chamber, presumably emerging somewhere beyond the house. Jacob Morrison had not just offered her a hiding place, he had provided an escape route. From above, she heard the sound of horses arriving in the yard, followed by rough voices calling out. She crept up the steps until she could hear the conversation through the cellar door. Morning, Jacob Morrison's voice carried clearly in the still air. You fellows look like you've been riding hard. We're looking for someone, replied a voice that made Ayana's blood run cold. It was harsh and commanding, with an undertone of barely controlled violence. A young Indian woman. Would have passed this way in the last day or two. Lot of ground out here, Jacob Morrison replied evenly. Don't see many folks passing through my particular patch of it. You lawmen? There was a pause before the man answered. We're working with the territorial authorities. This woman is wanted in connection with a raid on a settler's farm. Killed a family and stole provisions. Ayana pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp of outrage. They were describing her as a murderer, making her the villain in a story where she had been the victim. The lies came so easily to these men that she wondered how often they had used similar deceptions to justify their actions. That's serious business, Jacob Morrison said, and Ayana could hear the careful neutrality in his voice. Can't say I've seen any young women, Indian or otherwise. What makes you think she came this direction? Tracks lead this way from the village. She's on foot, probably desperate for food and shelter. A soft-hearted rancher might take her in without knowing what she'd done. The implied threat was clear. Jacob Morrison was being warned that helping her would make him an accomplice to murder. Ayanna felt sick knowing that her presence was putting him in danger, but she also felt a flicker of hope at his response. "Well, I appreciate the warning," he said. "If I see anyone matching that description, I'll be sure to handle the situation appropriately. See that you do." The voice grew harder. "This woman is dangerous, Morrison. Don't let any misplaced sympathy get you or your neighbors killed." So they knew Jacob Morrison's name. That suggested these men were not just random raiders but part of some larger organization with knowledge of the local area and its inhabitants. Ayanna remembered her grandmother's words about the rancher with kind eyes, and wondered if their meeting had been less accidental than it seemed. "I'll keep my eyes open," Jacob Morrison promised. "You fellows want some coffee before you move on? Long ride ahead if you're planning to search the whole territory. No time for socializing. We've got ground to cover before this killer gets too far away." There was the sound of horses being reined around. "Remember what I said? Morrison, help her, and you become part of the problem." "Understood," Jacob Morrison replied. The horses departed at the same steady pace they had arrived, but Ayanna remained in the cellar for several more minutes. When Jacob Morrison finally called down to her, his voice was strained with anger. "They're gone, but stay put for a few more minutes. I want to make sure they're not doubling back." When she finally emerged from the root cellar, Ayanna found Jacob Morrison standing by the kitchen window, still holding his rifle. His face was grim, but when he saw her expression, his anger seemed to shift from the departed riders to something deeper. "They lied," he said simply. "Those weren't lawmen, and you're not a killer." "How do you know?" Ayanna asked, though she was grateful for his faith in her. "Because lawmen would have shown me papers, maybe a warrant. They would have searched the property instead of just asking questions and making threats." Jacob Morrison set his rifle aside and looked directly at her. "And because I knew your grandmother." The words hit Ayanna like a physical blow. She stared at him, searching his face for signs of deception but finding none. "You knew her? How?" Jacob Morrison was quiet for a long moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. "Your grandmother saved my life 15 years ago. I was injured in a hunting accident, lost and bleeding in the wilderness. She found me, tended my wounds, and got me back to safety. Never asked for anything in return." "She never spoke of this," Ayanna said. Though even as she said it, she remembered her grandmother's words about the rancher with kind eyes. Perhaps the old woman had known exactly where she was sending her granddaughter. "She wouldn't have," Jacob Morrison replied. "Your people and mine don't always get along. And she was protecting both of us by keeping quiet about it. But she told me that if anyone from her family ever needed help, I should provide it if I could." Understanding began to dawn on Ayanna. "She sent me here on purpose." "I believe so. She was a wise woman, able to see things others missed. If she sent you to me, she must have known what was coming." Jacob Morrison moved to the table and sat down heavily. "Those men who just left, they're part of something bigger. The Garrett gang has been working with corrupt officials to justify their raids. They attack settlements, then claim the survivors are criminals to cover their tracks. My village," Ayanna began, then stopped as the full horror of the situation became clear. "They will say my people attacked first? Probably. It's an old trick, but effective. Who's going to contradict them? The witnesses are dead or scattered." Jacob Morrison's voice was bitter with the injustice of it. "But they made a mistake coming here." "What do you mean?" "I mean they just threatened the wrong person. Your grandmother didn't just save my life that day, she saved my soul. I'd been ready to give up, to lie down in the woods and die rather than face another day of trying to survive out here alone." He looked up at Ayanna, with determination in his eyes. "I owe her more than I can ever repay, and that debt extends to you." Ayanna felt overwhelmed by the revelation. Her grandmother had sent her not to a stranger, but to someone who owed the old woman a life debt. It was like her grandmother was still protecting her from beyond the grave. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now we get you somewhere safe, while I figure out how to expose these men for what they really are." Jacob Morrison stood and began pacing. "They'll be back. Probably with more men. They're not going to give up easily. Where can I go? They will look everywhere." "Not everywhere. There's a mission about 2 days' ride from here, run by a priest named Father Miguel. He takes in anyone who needs help, no questions asked. The Garrett gang won't bother him because he has connections to the territorial governor." The idea of leaving again, of returning to the uncertainty of flight, filled Ayanna with dread. But she could see the logic in Jacob Morrison's suggestion. As long as she remained at the ranch, she was putting him in danger. "When do I leave?" she asked. "Tonight. Travel at night. Hide during the day. I'll give you supplies, and one of my horses. She's fast and sure-footed, knows the way to the mission." Jacob Morrison paused, studying her face. "But first, we need to take care of something else." "What?" "Those men are going to spread word that you're a dangerous killer. Once that story takes hold, you'll never be safe anywhere in the territory." Jacob Morrison's expression was grimmer than she had seen it. "We need to make sure the truth comes out first." "How?" "There's a newspaperman in town, fellow named Thompson. He's honest, and he doesn't like the Garrett gang any more than I do. If we can get your story to him, along with some evidence of what really happened, he might be able to print the truth before their lies take root." The plan was dangerous for both of them. If the Garrett gang learned that Jacob Morrison was actively working against them, his isolated ranch would become a target. But Ayanna could see the determination in his eyes, and knew that arguing would be useless. "My grandmother chose well when she sent me here," she said quietly. "Your grandmother was the finest person I've ever known," Jacob Morrison replied. "The least I can do is try to be worthy of the faith she had in people." As they began planning for the dangerous night ahead, neither of them noticed the lone rider watching from a distant ridge. The man with the scar had left one of his followers behind to observe the ranch, and now he was learning everything he needed to know about Jacob Morrison's intentions. The game was becoming more complex, but that only made it more interesting. By evening, the storm that had been threatening all day finally began to materialize. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind carried the promise of heavy rain. It would make travel difficult, but it might also provide cover for Ayanna's escape. Jacob Morrison spent the afternoon preparing supplies and checking his weapons. The horse he had selected for Ayanna was a sturdy mare named Star, known for her intelligence and stamina. As darkness fell, he led the animal to the back of the house, where Ayanna waited with a pack of provisions and the knife he had given her. "Remember," he said as she mounted the horse, "follow the river north until you reach the old oak tree with the lightning scar. Then head east toward the mountains. You'll see the mission bell tower before you reach the building itself." Ayanna nodded, committing the directions to memory. "What about you?" "I'll ride to town tomorrow, talk to Thompson. If all goes well, your story will be in print before the week is out." Jacob Morrison looked up at the gathering storm clouds. "That rain will wash out your tracks. Make it harder for anyone to follow you." As the first drops of rain began to fall, Ayanna felt the weight of leaving safety for the unknown dangers of the prairie. But she also felt something she had not experienced since fleeing her village: hope. Her grandmother's wisdom had led her to Jacob Morrison, and his courage was giving her a chance to reclaim her life and honor. "I will not forget your kindness," she said. "Just stay alive." Jacob Morrison replied, "That's the best way to honor your grandmother's memory." As Ayanna rode away into the darkness, the storm broke over the prairie with sudden violence. Rain fell in sheets, and lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, brilliant flashes. Behind her, the lights of the ranch house grew dim and finally disappeared entirely. She did not see the armed men who approached the house shortly after her departure, or hear the gunshots that echoed briefly across the prairie before being swallowed by the storm. Her focus was entirely on the treacherous path ahead and the hope that somewhere in the distance, safety and justice might still be possible. The storm raged through the night, turning the prairie into a treacherous maze of slippery grass and hidden gullies. Ayana clung to Star's reins as the mare picked her way carefully through the darkness, guided by instincts that seemed sharper than human sight. Lightning provided brief glimpses of the landscape, but between the flashes, the world disappeared into an impenetrable wall of rain and wind. By dawn, the worst of the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by the deluge. Streams that had been mere trickles the day before now ran full and fast, and the air carried the fresh scent of rain-washed earth. Ayana found shelter in a grove of cottonwood trees near one of the swollen creeks, where she could rest Star and wait out the daylight hours. As she sat beneath the trees, sharing dried meat with her horse and listening to the sounds of the awakening prairie, Ayana found herself thinking about Jacob Morrison. The connection between him and her grandmother had explained so much about the old woman's final words. Her grandmother had always possessed an uncanny ability to know things she could not possibly have known, to sense currents of fate that remained invisible to others. But now, alone again in the wilderness, Ayana wondered if she would ever learn whether Jacob Morrison had succeeded in reaching the newspaper office, or whether the Garrett gang had silenced him before he could tell the truth about what had happened to her village. The uncertainty gnawed at her almost as much as hunger and exhaustion. When evening came, she resumed her journey, following the river north as Jacob Morrison had instructed. The landscape gradually changed as she traveled, becoming more rugged and mountainous. Pine trees appeared among the cottonwoods and oak, and the air grew cooler and thinner. Star seemed to know where they were going, often choosing paths that Ayana would not have seen in the darkness. On the second night of travel, Ayana finally saw what she had been looking for: the distinctive silhouette of a mission bell tower outlined against the star-filled sky. Relief flooded through her as she urged Star forward, but caution made her approach slowly. Jacob Morrison had assured her that Father Miguel could be trusted, but 3 days of flight had taught her that assumptions could be deadly. The mission was larger than she had expected, with several buildings arranged around a central courtyard. Warm light glowed in the windows, and she could hear the sound of voices singing what she recognized as hymns. The peaceful scene was so different from the violence and fear she had experienced that for a moment she wondered if she might be hallucinating. She dismounted near the main gate and led Star forward on foot, her hand resting on the knife Jacob Morrison had given her. As she approached the entrance, a figure emerged from the shadows. A small, elderly man in the brown robes of a Franciscan priest. "You must be Ayana," he said in accented English, his voice warm with welcome. "Jacob Morrison sent word that you might be coming." The relief was so overwhelming that Ayana nearly collapsed. "You know Jacob Morrison?" "Indeed. He rode here yesterday morning to speak with me." Father Miguel gestured for her to follow him into the courtyard. "Come. You must be exhausted. We have food and a place for you to rest." As they walked through the mission grounds, Ayana noticed other people moving about. Men and women of various ages and backgrounds, all of whom seemed to belong to some community she did not understand. Father Miguel noticed her curiosity. "This mission serves many purposes," he explained. "We provide sanctuary for those fleeing violence or persecution, education for children who would otherwise have none, and medical care for anyone who needs it. You are welcome here for as long as necessary." They entered a simple but comfortable building where several women were preparing the evening meal. The smells of roasting meat and baking bread made Ayana's mouth water despite her nervousness. Father Miguel introduced her to the women, who welcomed her without questions or suspicion. As she ate the first hot meal she had enjoyed since leaving Jacob Morrison's ranch, Father Miguel told her what he had learned from the rancher's visit. "The Garrett gang has been spreading their lies throughout the territory, claiming you are a dangerous criminal. But Jacob Morrison was able to reach the newspaper office before they could silence him." "Is he safe?" Ayana asked, remembering the worry that had plagued her during her journey. Father Miguel's expression grew somber. "The gang attacked his ranch the night you left, but they found it empty. Jacob had anticipated this and moved to town immediately after you departed. He is safe, but his home was burned." The news hit Ayana like a physical blow. Jacob Morrison had lost his ranch, his livelihood, everything he had built, because he had chosen to help her. The guilt was almost unbearable. "It is not your fault," Father Miguel said gently, reading her expression. Jacob Morrison made his choice knowing the risks. He told me that he owed a debt to your grandmother that could only be repaid by protecting you. Over the following days, as Ayanna recovered her strength and began to adapt to life at the mission, more news arrived from the outside world. Jacob Morrison's story had indeed been published in the territorial newspaper, but the Garrett gang had responded by intensifying their claims that Ayanna was a murderer. The situation had become a battle of competing narratives, with truth and lies warring for the hearts and minds of the territorial population. Father Miguel shared these developments with Ayanna as they walked in the mission garden one evening, discussing her future. The governor has ordered an investigation into the Garrett gang's activities, he said, but such investigations take time, and meanwhile, you remain in danger. I cannot stay here forever, Ayanna replied. These people have shown me great kindness, but this is not my home. Where is your home now? Father Miguel asked gently. Your village is gone. Your family scattered or dead. Sometimes we must build new homes from the ashes of the old. The question haunted Ayanna as the weeks passed. She learned to read and write English from one of the mission teachers, helped in the garden and kitchen, and listened to the stories of other refugees who had found their way to this sanctuary. Each person had lost something precious and was trying to build a new life from the fragments of the old. One evening, as autumn painted the mountain leaves in shades of gold and red, a familiar figure appeared at the mission gates. Jacob Morrison looked older and more weathered than when Ayanna had last seen him, but his eyes still held the same kindness that had convinced her to trust him. The investigation is complete, he told Ayanna and Father Miguel as they sat in the priest's study. The territorial authorities have arrested most of the Garrett gang, including their leader. The evidence against them was overwhelming once people started coming forward with their stories. And my name? Ayanna asked. Cleared completely. The truth about what happened to your village is now part of the official record. Jacob Morrison smiled for the first time since his arrival. You're free to go wherever you choose, without fear of pursuit. The news should have filled Ayanna with joy, but instead, she felt strangely empty. Freedom was meaningless without purpose, and she was no closer to knowing where she belonged in a world that had been forever changed by violence and loss. Father Miguel seemed to understand her confusion. Freedom is not a destination, he said. It is the opportunity to choose your own path. The question is not where you can go, but where you want to go. That night, Ayanna walked alone in the mission garden, thinking about the choices before her. She could try to find other survivors from her village, attempt to rebuild something resembling her old life. She could remain at the mission, helping others as she had been helped. Or she could venture into the wider world, using her experiences to forge an entirely new identity. As she pondered these options, she heard footsteps behind her. Jacob Morrison approached, carrying a letter in his weathered hands. This came for you today, he said, handing her the envelope. It's from a woman named Sarah Crow Feather. She says she's your cousin. It's not billed of the moment. Ayanna's hands trembled as she opened the letter. Sarah Crow Feather had been among those who escaped the attack on their village, and she had spent weeks gathering other survivors in a safe location near the Canadian border. The letter described a small but growing community of refugees who were working to preserve their culture and traditions while adapting to new circumstances. She asks if you want to join them, Jacob Morrison said. Says they could use someone with your knowledge of English and the white man's ways to help them negotiate with government officials. For the first time since fleeing her village, Ayanna felt a spark of true hope. The opportunity to help her people rebuild, to serve as a bridge between two worlds that too often misunderstood each other, gave her life meaning again. I think I know where I belong now, she said. Jacob Morrison smiled. Your grandmother would be proud. 2 days later, Ayanna prepared to leave the mission for what she hoped would be the last time. Father Miguel had arranged for an escort to take her safely to the border, and Jacob Morrison had provided supplies for the journey. As she said goodbye to the people who had sheltered and protected her, Ayanna felt she was finally ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. But before departing, she sought a private moment with Jacob Morrison. They stood together in the mission courtyard, where autumn sunlight filtered through the changing leaves. I can never repay what you sacrificed for me, she said. You don't need to repay anything, Jacob Morrison replied. Your grandmother taught me that kindness creates its own rewards. Seeing you safe and free is payment enough. What will you do now? Your ranch is gone. Jacob Morrison looked thoughtful. Father Miguel has offered me a position here, helping to manage the mission's operations. I think I'd like to try that for a while. Maybe it's time for this old rancher to do something different with his life. As Ayana rode away from the mission with her escort, she carried with her more than just supplies and memories. She carried the knowledge that even in the darkest times, there were people willing to risk everything for strangers in need. Her grandmother's faith in human goodness had been vindicated, and that faith would guide Ayana as she worked to rebuild her shattered world. The journey to the border took 5 days, through country that grew increasingly wild and beautiful as they traveled north. When they finally reached the refugee settlement, Ayana was amazed by what the survivors had accomplished. Temporary shelters had given way to more permanent structures, gardens provided fresh food, and children played games that echoed the traditions of their ancestors. Sarah Crowfeather met her at the edge of the settlement, and the two women embraced with tears of joy and sorrow. They had both lost much, but they had found each other again. And together, they could begin the long work of healing and renewal. In the months that followed, Ayana discovered her true calling as a mediator between the refugee community and the outside world. Her knowledge of English and her understanding of white customs made her invaluable in negotiations with government officials, traders, and missionaries. But more importantly, her experience of loss and recovery gave her the wisdom to help others navigate their own journeys, from despair to hope. Years later, when the settlement had grown into a thriving community with schools, farms, and businesses, Ayana would often tell the story of her grandmother's final gift. The knowledge that even in the darkest hours, there are always people willing to extend a hand to those in need. The rancher with kind eyes had honored a debt that could never truly be repaid. And in doing so, he had helped preserve not just one life, but an entire way of life that might otherwise have been lost forever. The prairie wind still sang its endless song across the grasslands, carrying with it the scents of sage and wildflowers, and the promise of storms that might come with each new dawn. But now it also carried stories of courage and compassion, of bridges built between different peoples, and of the eternal truth that hope can survive even the cruelest winters of the human heart. In her small cabin at the edge of the settlement, Ayana kept 2 treasures that reminded her of the journey that had brought her to this new life. Her grandmother's leather pouch, with its sacred contents, and the knife that Jacob Morrison had given her on that desperate morning when she had asked, shaking with fear, if she could stay until the bandits left. The rancher had quietly agreed, and in that simple act of kindness, he had set in motion events that would echo through generations, proving that sometimes the smallest gestures of human decency can change the entire course of history.